Hello and welcome, everyone. Welcome to Armanino, Diach, Decipher, and Peer Monitor's co-hosted webinar. We're really excited to talk about the legal industry insights for 2021 planning today. And during the webinar, we're going to talk about the current state of the legal industry and what's ahead for next year. But before we get into the content, I like to go through a couple of housekeeping items. You can maximize or minimize the webinar pane during the presentation by using the red, orange arrow buttons. During the webinar, we also encourage you to ask questions. In the webinar pane, you'll see a question box that you can use to type your question in and click submit. Our presenters will answer those questions as time allows during our Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Excuse me. We do ask everyone to hold on to your questions till the end of the presentation, as some of those questions may be answered during the course of the session. Also, to ensure good audio quality, please check your settings to ensure the appropriate audio option is selected, like shown here. If you're using a telephone, please click on the phone call audio option, or if you're listening through your computer, then please click on the computer audio option. And lastly, I just want to mention to the group that we will be sending the deck and the recording of this webinar 24 to 48 hours after the presentation. So have a look out for an email from us. And if you don't receive anything, please make sure to check your spam folders. And if you still haven't received anything, feel free to email us using the confirmation email that you got for this webinar. So we have a great topic today, and we're going to be talking about lots of things. So, but just a few more details about today's agenda. We'll be talking about key industry metrics. So we will be providing insights on the impacts of the pandemic and a forecast for 2021 with a focus on the Western US mid-sized firms contrasted with national firms. We will also be talking about the West Coast financial overview. So going to be talking about the overall industry assessment, highlighting the impacts of PPP loans, red flag warnings, action items for upcoming year, and so on. And then we're going to talk about lateral moves, so updates on the lateral acquisition space, what's driving current acquisitions, and what competition look like in 2021. And lastly, we're going to be putting all of this together in a summary of what your 2021 strategy should be and what your thinking process should look like. And we have some great speakers on the call today. We have Stephen Diach. He's a principal at Diach Consulting. Stephen has been advising law firms and legal industry companies on their strategy, culture, and client development since 2009. And prior to that, he practiced law, founded several legal information and educational businesses, and spent 20 years at Thomson Reuters, including 6 years as a VP and CMO of Thomson Consulting Services, comprised of Hildebrandt, excuse my pronunciation, Baker Robbins, and Thomson Litigation Consulting. We also have Michael Ellenhorn, who's a founder and CEO of Decipher. Decipher helps their clients grow safely and more effectively, reducing lateral hire risk and cost of conducting deep dive due diligence investigation on prospective partners before they are hired. Decipher boasts a 97% increase success rate and is committed to helping law firms improve both their bottom line and overall performance through better talent outcomes. We also have Dave Roberts from Armanino. Dave is a partner of Armanino's law firm services practice. He has worked exclusively with law firms and the legal industry for the past 30 years. As I mentioned, he's the partner in charge of our law firm services group and has previously held positions with PwC's law firm consulting group. On a daily basis, Dave consults with the executive and finance leadership of law firms on a variety of issues. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have Brent Turner. Brent is a manager at Peer Monitor, the legal industry's digital benchmarking program. He examines how law firms leaders can leverage Peer Monitor to increase firm profitability through key metrics of law firm financials and operational performance. In addition to helping firms effectively make positive changes through competitive comparisons, Brent has participated as a speaker and featured panelist as many leading industry events across the US, Canada, UK, and Australia. Brent joined Peer Monitor in 2011 and previously held positions with Gartner and Riot Medical. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Stephen to get us started with the content. Stephen, please take it away.
Sarah, thank you very much. And I want to thank Armanino for hosting this seminar. And Sarah at Armanino and her team have been terrific in helping us get this organized and presenting it today. I want to thank everyone for joining us on this program. Our goal today is to bring together several of the nation's leading experts on the legal industry, the trends we're seeing, and very current up-to-date data on what's been happening this year. The goal again here is to provide you with information and market insights that will aid you in developing your plans for the next 6 to 9 months. So let's get to it. We're going to start with Brent and Peer Monitor.
All right, thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be with you here. Sarah, if you want to maybe shove on to the next slide, I just wanted to spend a brief moment discussing the data source of Peer Monitor. I know that many of you are versed in it. Some of your firms participate in it, so you know this all too well. But before I get into the economic health of the industry as we see it through July, I did want to discuss the data source simply because it is quite unique in nature. So Peer Monitor at its core is an automated benchmarking platform that's been around for 16 years. But the inception of Peer Monitor really came about as a response to survey-based data in the legal industry. Rather, Peer Monitor took more of a blue ocean approach in saying, can we draw data directly from the firm's financial management systems to get fact-based data that can't be gamed or takes some sort of onus on the firm to produce the data results, and set up some sort of an automated information flow and be completely system agnostic as far as the financial management systems go. So that's absolutely what they set out to do back in 2005. Today, we work with over 200 firms. Sarah mentioned some of the travels that I've had, but it speaks to Peer Monitor's participant base. Certainly founded in the US, we've expanded to the UK, Australia, and Canada. The data that I'm going to be sharing with you here today is going to be the US firms, of which we have slightly more than 170. The breakdown of that, because I will take a look at segment performance. AmLaw 100, slightly more than half of the AmLaw 100, slightly more than half of the AmLaw Second 100, and then slightly north of 70 mid-sized firms. We term a mid-sized firm simply a firm that falls outside of AmLaw segmentation, but in terms of lawyer size, they average about 125 lawyers are mid-sized firms. So just to give you that sense. So again, fact-based data coming directly from the financial management system. We have a monthly data flow because it is automated. So as we power through this COVID-19 downturn, certainly have a fairly timely finger on the pulse of the industry. So in speaking to the headlines and the things that we're seeing come through Peer Monitor, thank you, Sarah. Our headline in July was the annual summer doldrums. So we are processing our August data as we speak. I was just viewing it this morning, so I'll speak to that a little bit. But in terms of July 20, we were down 1.2% in demand. Now that's measuring billable hours. However, that 1.2% it's almost a falsely inflated simply because of our working day equation. We had one more working day this July 20 than we did in July 19. Work rates, moving down the headlines here, work rates fell from 5.2 to 4.9%. These are still nearing record highs. The 5.2% is a record high in that 16 years of Peer Monitor. The reason that work rate growth is so high during this pandemic, during this economic downturn, isn't that firms are necessarily pushing their rates hard in the marketplace. Rather, it's a byproduct of partners essentially hoarding hours. There's a higher proportion of hours going to partners right now than associates, which we of course have seen in many economic downturns. But what that does to our work rate growth is that partners grow their rates more aggressively than associates. So when you have that higher proportionality, your resulting effect is what we're seeing here in work rates. Fees worked, proxy for revenue, it's simply work rates multiplied by demand. but it remained positive. It grew 3.7, a long way of saying that revenues are fairly good. I guess I would describe it as we move through these last 4 and 5 months. Lawyer growth is also something that we've started to see fall. That probably comes as a surprise to no one. But I would say with the speed that we've seen that come is what's notable. When we look back at the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009, it took firms a lot longer to kind of start to slow that water spigot, slow that flow of lawyer growth. But we're seeing that being fairly aggressively done currently. And then, of course, expenses. Also, firms needing to manage the bottom line right now, certainly with the amount of uncertainty, we've seen a pretty significant cut to expenses. Moving over to the right-hand side of this slide is our overall demand picture. For those of you that participate in Peer Monitor, you know this one well. We've been building it out quarter over quarter since 2007. And so many people have been asking us, how does this downturn compare to the GFC? And so this should spell it out clearly. We have gotten to the same depth in terms of contraction at the end of Q2 of 20 as we were at in Q2 of 09. Now, what was different about the GFC, of course, it's a completely different crisis. It's where our economic institutions were completely failing, and this downturn is all about health and getting people back to work. But when comparing the two, the GFC lasted 8 quarters, at least through the eyes of Peer Monitor. There was 8 consecutive quarters of contraction, and there were 3 quarters within that 8 that contracted greater than 5.9%. So while we did decline at 5.9%, we weren't to the same depth of the GFC. And I think by and large, most folks would at least guess today that we're not going to go as wide of a time, that 8 quarters, that 2 years of contraction. But of course, that remains to be seen. So shoving forward to average daily demand, I certainly wanted to share these next metrics with you. So, I had to talk about that fiddle factor of working days in terms of July and how you have to kind of go into looking at July numbers with that in mind. Average daily demand, of course, normalizes all of that. And average daily demand, and interesting in Peer Monitor terms, we've had so many firms, while we have a monthly data flow, we've had a lot of firms come to us and say, hey, is there any way we can have a daily data flow? Simply because so many firms are measuring daily productivity levels. They may have been doing it pre-pandemic, but if they weren't, they're certainly doing it now. So this is our most accurate look, I think, really at true demand. So it's a bit eye-popping, July, right, down 8%. Now, just in looking back in April, of course, we were expecting that decline to happen in April. We just weren't sure where we'd land. May a little bit better than April, June a little bit worse than May. July down from June, but if you look at the historicals, this was no surprise. This minus 8%. I've chatted about it a few times. The idea of the PTO bomb, which is this ominous term. But if you go and Google search it, you'll come up with some really interesting articles. And there's one that I particularly like. I believe it was the Chicago Tribune, but it was really, I'm based in Minneapolis. So cold weather, all of us are trying to get out of Minneapolis, and folks are trying to get out of Chicago to warm weather destinations, of course, in March and April. And as the pandemic hit us all, folks were canceling vacations. They were essentially gathering up all this PTO they were planning to spend, and everyone was top heavy with PTO as we moved into the summer months. So the idea of the PTO bomb was, this is an exclusive to the legal market, this was all verticals, is that more people are simply going to be taking more vacations this summer than we maybe have ever seen. So when we saw those July numbers come in, it's like, well, there's our PTO bomb effect. Now, what's interesting is that I've been saying, if you look at our historical patterns and we talk about recovery and where we might start to see some sense of recovery, I was always looking to September. Now, not to speak too much about August as we're finalizing numbers, but certainly those firms that are part of this program will see this. August is at least from what we can see right now, coming in fairly well. Now, I'm not trying to say that we're in positive demand territory, but I would say that it is bucking the trend of historical demand patterns. And so if we were eager to get September data in the door in Peer Monitor before, we certainly are now, if August appears to be one of our best pandemic performance months, as at least early indicators look like it is going to be. And looking forward now to key performance measures, and this is taking a bit deeper look at the various segments on the next slide. Thanks, Sarah. In terms of demand, AmLaw 100, second 100, midsize on the far left-hand side of the chart, and you see that this is looking through those first 4 months of the pandemic, April, May, June, and July versus last year at the same time. You can see that there's a fair amount of parity among the various segments. Everyone was in contraction mode, right around 5%, and then the mid-size slightly greater than 5% contraction. What is a very different story, though, is the worked rate picture. And that's something that's not very new. For the last 2 to 3 years, the AmLaw 100 has really been pushing on rate growth. AmLaw second 100 really started kind of pushing on that pedal as well about a year and a half ago. And midsize, at a high level, at a very average level, it's arguable as to whether or not they have really pushed rates. And when you really start to peel apart the AmLaw 100, the AmLaw 50 is actually, the worked rate growth through July was 6.7%. But again, that is a lot of partner hours, more so than you probably experienced in April through July of 19. Moving forward to fees worked, again, the proxy for revenue. Back slide there, Sarah. Fees worked to proxy for revenue. You see that AmLaw 100 is leading the way there, second 100 even in midsize and slight contraction. And then productivity is really explained by lawyer growth. This has been an imbalance that we've witnessed since the beginning of this program, at least, in terms of lawyer growth outpacing demand. So even when we've been in positive demand times, we will typically find that lawyer growth is pacing at a percentage slightly north of that, always pulling down productivity, and it leads to this greater inefficiency. So as we get more heads, more lawyers into firms and into the legal market, and either whether hours are contracting, they still aren't, or growing, they're still not matching that level of lawyer headcount growth. So certainly a point of concern, but nothing new. And then moving forward and looking at some of the various cities in the Western region here on the next key performance chart. Thanks, Sarah. We did start to peel things back a little bit to take a look. Now we, of course, this data is sufficiently aggregated, so there's at least 30 firms that are participating in each of these jurisdictions before we show data in a public setting. But looking at Seattle, Phoenix, Denver, LA, and San Francisco, these are stack ranked essentially in terms of their contraction in demand, with Seattle having the least amount of contraction and San Francisco having the greatest. Los Angeles, of course, having the second greatest amount of contraction, but for those of you that, I'm sure most folks are well aware, and I know that many of you sit in California, one of the earlier states to shut down in April, and gosh, if memory serves me, it might even been late March, but then had some flare-ups in terms of COVID-19 cases throughout these past 4 months. So it should come as no surprise that demand contraction is likely down more in California than it is in some of those other Western cities. Certainly with work rates, with the exception of Phoenix, work rate growth has been quite healthy. I often say in those first few years after the great financial crisis, so call it 2010, 2011, 2012, we often talked about, gosh, if the industry could just get back to 2% work rate growth, we could start to talk about some serious revenue growth. And I mean, we passed that line clearly several years ago. So I often still think about that, especially in times of a downturn, that 2% high watermark of the past. And look what this high watermark is in the cities that we're reflecting on here currently. So even Phoenix, pacing slightly north of 4%, and thinking back what our old standard was, they're doubled up on that, quite frankly. And then I would just cycle all the way over to lawyer growth, and this is certainly an interesting phenomenon that we witnessed when we pulled the data. But just in terms of the lawyer headcount growth in Seattle and in San Francisco, well outpacing the other cities. Now, whether that's due to either our firm mix, but again, these are a fairly significant population in each of the cities, or if it's in terms of various sectors, I'm afraid that we don't have visibility into that, but certainly food for thought for those of you that kind of have boots on the ground or better visibility into those cities than perhaps that I do. And so then moving ahead, wanted to share with you a little bit of the productivity numbers and what we're seeing in terms of lawyer efficiency. I was talking about that imbalance. We always seem to be growing lawyer growth in a fashion that outpaces demand for their services. And so what we've been witnessing over the course of this pandemic, this 126 hours that we see with associates, and this is looking at a high level, this is looking across all segments. But the 126 hours on average per average associate per month is the lowest that we've seen in Peer Monitor in 16 years. So we are at our low point here and at the 126. And then as you look at the equity partners and the income partners, of course, they have taken hits as well during the COVID-19 pandemic, but certainly not to the degree that associates have taken that same hit. So again, getting back to this idea of partners hoarding hours, and it's been interesting. In the month of April, we witnessed this happen right away. And as we spoke about it with some of the firm leaders that are clients of ours, some of the discussion was around, well, these are very unprecedented and uncertain times. And a lot of our P1 clients are in need of the partner running the front of the relationship with the firm right now, not so much the associates. So it's almost like hand-holding with our most important clients. And then as May came in and we saw that phenomenon continue, some of the discussion was around, well, you know, we're in remote working environments, and a lot of our partners are finding that it's much easier to do things themselves than to walk down the hall to train an associate, simply because they can't walk down to the hall to train the associate anymore, and they find it harder to do so via Zoom or Teams or whatever your virtual environment happens to be. But then when you see it happen again in June, you see it happen again in July, and I know this doesn't have July numbers, but it continue to occur. I think you get further away from those reasons and probably back to the age-old issue of economic downturns usually spells partner hoarding of hours in order to meet their billable hour goals first and foremost. So it's almost our compensation systems getting in the way of probably how we really want the firm to perform. Now, again, early August numbers, so I don't mean to make a big deal about it, but it seems at least with 1 month of August that is starting to shift a little bit. So we'll wait for the coming months to come in, but hopefully we're turning around from that, because of course 2008, 2009 led us to laying off nearly 9% of associates, in large part due to this very phenomenon. So I just wanted to wrap up with expenses on the next slide here, Sarah. We capture both overhead and direct expenses within Peer Monitor, but this is just really digging into overhead and staff compensation there on the left, and I'll just kind of let you drink that chart in, I guess, yourself. But I really wanted to spend my time focusing on the right-hand side of this chart. So this is looking at, of course, the overhead categories, not all of our overhead categories, but the large ones that we capture within Peer Monitor, and looking at all segments. Now, those gray boxes next to each category are the proportions. And so, of course, recruiting being our smallest piece of the pie, staff compensation being our largest. So they're not all created equal, of course. Now, staff compensation down 3.4% in Q2 20 over Q2 19. Certainly speaking to some of the layoffs, the furloughs that we're witnessing, we're hearing that a lot of partners are finding ways to get by without secretaries or secretary hours as much as they had in the past. We'd certainly expect that phenomenon to continue. Occupancy down 2%. Some folks are fairly surprised that it's not down more. From what I understand, a lot of the lease agreements are fairly ironclad. So I guess the way I would state that is this is going to be obviously very long term. In my personal opinion, you're going to see this power on for years, this contraction around occupancy. If you happen to be a firm that has been lucky enough to essentially have your lease come up in the last 4 months, I'm sure you're looking to negotiate that down. I know of a AmLaw 100 firm that had their lease come up in March, and I believe they went from 170,000 square feet, and then they wanted options all the way down to 60,000 square feet. And so you're talking massive reductions in terms of office space, which of course we'd expect. I jump ahead to technology, down slightly. Some people are surprised by that as well. That's driven in large part by AmLaw 100. A lot of them had technologies and virtual technologies ready to step off of the office and into a virtual environment there at the beginning of April. They already had those technologies in-house. As you move down market, maybe not so many AmLaw Second 100 firms, but certainly some mid-sized firms that we work with, we knew that they had their IT staff, needing to quickly get, PCs and things like that, because they still had towers. Some of them had towers at the firm and things like that. So as you look at the various segments, the technology spend picture is a little bit different, but a lot of it is getting wheels spinning to get to that virtual environment. I think you'll get more of a true look at what actual tech spend will be in the coming months. It's just that the first few months of survival mode was very different at various ends of the market. Marketing and BD down nearly 73%, eye-popping figure. That is actually fairly consistent across the segment. But I would say marketing and business development, there is a lot of live events that is wrapped up into those budgets. And there's a fair amount of travel actually that's wrapped up into those budgets. So is marketing and BD down? Absolutely. Peeling apart that general ledger account isn't easy, but I would say that it is probably a fraction of what you see here in the 73%, given the live events that are no longer being done. And then the thing that I would end up with is with recruiting, certainly our smallest category. But this is a trend that we've been seeing for about 2 years, is this contraction on recruiting expense. And we had a chat about this beforehand, and there isn't really any sensible way from PureMonitor's perspective to peel that apart to speak to what is going on there. I would say it's an indicator of a slowdown in the lateral market. But the 46% contraction is something that's certainly new. When I talked contraction from a year ago, it's probably more in the teens somewhere. So 46% is doubled and tripled what the previous contraction had been. So with that, I think I am handing things over to Dave next.
Actually, Dave, before you start, this is Steve Deitch, and I want to thank Brent. Want to mention I had the honor of being managing director of PureMonitor for a couple of years. It is terrific information. It's unique in its currency and the way it's distributed and the way peer groups are selected. And as you think about strategy going forward, one of the foundations you need is insights into what the market is doing, what competitors are doing, what the trends are. By the way, I also want to mention that these slides will be sent out from Armanino to the attendees. You should have them by the end of the week at the latest. And also, if you have any questions, please use the question function on the webinar to type those out. We have set aside time at the end of the program to deal with any questions you have. And now on to Dave Roberts from Armanino.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. And Brent, as always, great job. Wonderful data. Anybody who's heard your presentations before knows how much that goes into this. So thank you. I drew the short straw in our group and I had to follow you. So you're always a great speaker with a tremendous amount of data. I am going to start. We can't have a conversation without talking about the PPP loans and what is going on here, the payroll protection program. It affected many law firms. And here are just some stats. About 14,000 law firms receive PPP funds between $150,000 and $10 million. And you can see the 4 states that represented over 40% of the total number of loans. California came in number 1 with almost 2,000 loans. New York with about 1,400. Florida, about 1,250, and then Texas with 1,160 loans. Interesting stat, 127 loans were between the $5 and $10 million mark. You can see 11% from California, that was only 14 firms. See how small this number really is. The percentage of all loans over 5 million were, and it's not just the law firms, but the percentage of all PPP loans over 5 million were about 0.1% across the board. I believe, if my stats are right, about 84% of the total loans, and the loans were about 5 million loans, about 84% were under $150,000. So that's just kind of food for thought. 430, this is just an interesting stat here. 430,000 legal industry jobs were retained because of these PPP funds. Obviously, everyone knows now that if you got the PPP funds, you could not, or it was difficult. Firms did not lay off staff. Some firms furloughed and laid off. hired them back for the most part because of these PPP funds. It prevented a lot of the layoffs. Obviously, the larger firms over 500 employees could not participate in this PPP program. So moving on to the impact, kind of the overall impact of COVID on firms statistically, and this is really a West Coast statistic, is we didn't see any furloughs of equity partners, non-equity partners, or the management staff, really the C-suite. Less than 10% of firms furloughed associates, 20% furloughed admin staff, 3% laid off equity partners, obviously different than a furlough, 4% laid off non-equity partners, 15% laid off associates, and 35% of the firms laid off admin staff. Moving on, Sarah, for the overall predictions for really Q4 and beyond, what people have kind of referred to, COVID-19 and the PPP funds. Everybody, definitely all the mid-sized and smaller firms, and again, the firms over 500 employees could not participate in it. But COVID, the beginning of COVID, everybody hunkered down, excuse me, was into expense reduction and figuring out how to work remotely and just, kind of temporarily trying to get their act together. PPP came along, everybody focused on that. And we realized that we were not going to be working remotely on a short-term basis, so kind of get used to it, and everybody did. And we are starting to come out of this COVID-19 PPP coma because most of the management really focused on this stuff. The concept of what happens when the funds run out, which they really have, and we're now in the forgiveness portion of it. But firms, and this is kind of going into some of the other issues of, firms got the PPP money, they focused very quickly, as Brent was talking about, the marketing and BD budgets fell dramatically. Office expense was down, travel and entertainment went to close to zero. Staff compensation was down significantly. Partners focused on AR and collections. And you add on to that, people were starting to monitor daily productivity. And, many firms received these PPP loans. So for many firms, they are experiencing, notwithstanding the initial blast of COVID-19 and the concern that, Armageddon was happening and things were just going to fall apart, many firms are experiencing a really good year for 2020 and kind of white knuckling are very concerned about what's going to happen in 2021. As Brent was saying with some of the stats, it's interesting when you look at the mid-sized firms, the demand for legal services was the lowest of all the firms, the MWA 200 and MWA 100. The productivity was the lowest. The work rates were the lowest, but the lawyer growth was the highest. So you kind of scratch your head at that. And when you look at firms, they still had the same issues they had pre-COVID of productivity, trying to marketing and new clients, underproductive partners, cost containment. Those issues did not go away, and you're wrestling with trying to address these for Q4 and what's going to happen in 2021. The remote workforce, I think everybody is comfortable now with people working remotely, and there are lots of studies. with how many people are actually going to come back to work, and it really depends upon the actual job. And it kind of segments into to various classes. Younger people tend to want to come back to work, whether it's a social issue or just to have a quiet place to work away from kids and family. And some of the more mobile people and the older generation tend to say no thanks, I'm happy and effective working from home. So the remote workforce is, people have learned how to do this and is certainly here to stay. What COVID has also done, COVID has been really the great accelerator for many issues that law firms that we have all been wrestling with. One of them is talking about retirement and succession planning. And that we are starting to see now that firms are coming out of this, as I refer to it as this kind of coma, and trying to vision the new world order. They're looking at retirements, underproductive partners, as Brent was saying, hours and rate growth is up, and that's because partners are hoarding more of the hours. That doesn't bode well for leverage or for many things. So that's kind of going to shake out here. I'm not sure about Q4, but definitely in 2021. When I talk about new strategies are what are firms going to look like? Organizational structures, the remote workforce, the real estate footprint. In the future, the entire delivery of legal services is being re-looked at now. Merger activity has been, almost zero for the past number of months because of COVID, and I think we have some stats on that. But excuse me again. But the merger activity is just starting to tick up again, and will come back with a vengeance. One, just a little deferred maintenance, deferred demand here. And two, because of the problems that firms are facing overall and not able to deal with them fast enough, succession planning being one of them, and just a number of other issues. If we go to the productivity changes, due to COVID and the work from home, WFH, these are just some stats from mainly California. We surveyed, I believe it's about 250 California firms, and this is just what some of the stats came out. You see attorneys, firms, 18% of the firms said attorneys are less productive. 7% said they're more productive. Paralegals, 19% less productive, 12% more productive. Legal secretaries, no surprise here, 31% less productive. That's where if I read the tea leaves correctly, there's going to be a lot of organizational restructuring in terms of the admin staff. And you kind of see here some of the leading indicator here, 31% less productivity. Finance and accounting, interesting, 11% say more productive, 11% say less productive, a dead heat. I think that's because mainly you don't get a lot of partners walking into people's offices having talks about billing or customizing a bill or collections or doing it a little more efficiently. Marketing, no surprise here. HR, very similar. HR has a much heavier burden dealing with all the remote workforce. We still have to do evaluations. Many firms did salary reductions, so HR was heavy in dealing and communicating with people. And IT, no surprise here. IT was the winner of everything, being a net gain, 22% more productive. So no surprise here. I think the IT staff for most firms were their lifeblood. So going on to the financial performance. Next slide, Sarah. Thank you. Because of the COVID and the overall slowdown, again, many firms thought that 2020 was just going to be a horrible year, notwithstanding the decrease in demand and a lot of the stats that Brent was showing. Most firms on a cash basis are beating their projections that were done in the beginning of the year. And that's a good thing, but for the reasons I said before, because a lot of their costs are down so low. There's a very low client churn right now. BD is down, but clients are just not switching firms. Clients are dealing with COVID also, so their first thing is not necessarily switching law firms. So very low client churn right now. Expense reductions have been a very top priority since March, and most firms have cut almost down to the bone. There will probably, from all predictions, more layoffs coming, and kind of, as I said earlier, the organizational restructuring. And this last bullet here, with the focus on staff reduction, combined with the improved processes and increased utilization of technology, what we call process reengineering. Sarah, going on to the M&A activities. According to Altman's merger line, no surprise here, mergers and acquisitions were down 50% from prior years. There were only 7 in Q2 that were logged into merger line versus 20 in the prior year. Most were very small acquisitions of 5 or fewer lawyers. And this has been the lowest level of activity since 2010, a year in which we saw only 39 transactions during the entire year, obviously because of what was going on in the economy. But as I said, because of COVID, there were mergers that were in progress that just stopped cold, and people are starting to bring those activities back. So we believe Q4 will be a real strong rebound in merger activities along with 2021. Sarah, going on to the strategies, and then I'll wrap it up. I don't know if it was Steve and you, or Brent, but law firms are going and are already talking about, we've talked about this for years, if not decades, running more like a business. Now, many of the AM law firms already are. Many of the mid-sized firms are not. And what that means is really being a data-driven organization with a heavy focus on metrics and predictive metrics. And Steve, you're talking about peer monitor, great source of information. And firms are really going to start relying heavier on the information, on what's going on in the community, and really these predictive analytics of weather predicting of what may be happening in the future. Focus on processes and technology is going to be huge. And these are just what we believe to be strategies in the futures. To look towards SaaS-based services or outsourced services. SaaS is software as a service. And outsourced service providers to manage risks and inefficiencies for processes that are not a law firm's core competency. Obviously, a law firm's core competency is the delivery of legal services, and that's what clients care about. The processes, the technology, everything to get there. Again, some of the AmLaw firms doing great jobs, some of the mid-sized firms and smaller firms don't necessarily have the resources to go into that high level of technology and process re-engineering. So what we're starting to see is conversations of how they utilize the industry or use it on a fractionalized basis on a SaaS environment. And finally, to innovate and look to the future, really not so much the past, because what COVID has done is it changed our rule books, what we have seen in business schools and the trends over the past years and decades that we could rely on. COVID is unlike what happened in 2008 and 9 and 10 with a fairly significant rebound. This has forced firms to work remotely very successfully. That whole concept is not going to be going back to the old way, at least not 100%. And that's going to allow a lot of opportunities for firms. So when we talk about the future, that's projections, not necessarily the historical areas. That's where we get into really the data mining, the data projections, and the visioning of what's happening for the near future. And that's not a 10-year plan, if you will. The strategy and vision in the future, what's new, you need to be nimble. Things are going to continue to be changing, and the leadership in the firms are going to be key in being able to make these decisions on a fairly quick basis. So I'm going to wrap with that and turn it over to, I believe, Michael.
And Dave, this is Steve again. Thank you for that presentation. And for those of you that don't know Armanino or Dave Roberts, Armanino is one of the largest accounting and consulting firms in the West. And Dave is considered one of the wizards of our industry and has been advising law firms for many, many years. Encourage you to seek him out if you have questions. One of the pathways to growth when we think about strategy is hiring lateral partners or sometimes small groups, senior associates. And that's been an exploding area for a number of years now. But what's happening now in that space? And we want to hear from Michael Ellenhorn to Cipher, because he's got his eye on everything that's moving in that world. So let me turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks very much, and thanks very much to Armanino for hosting today. So let's just jump right in. I know we need to kind of move along. So looking just at the talent sector from a briefing perspective, it's good to see things in context. The legal industry, the legal vertical, is actually doing fairly well. Yes, we lost 6% on a macro basis from February to May. We gained a little bit back, but by comparison with many other industry sectors in the U.S., professional services and specifically the legal sector is actually doing very, very well. If you look at how COVID, about how our tracker data has lined up, if you look at law firms headquartered in the West, interestingly enough, those are, Sarah, can you move to the next slide? If you look at our tracker data, you will see that the West has actually done much better than the rest of the country. It's held up very, very nicely in terms of the number of firms and the types of firms that have actually announced some sort of employment modification or pay cuts. And of course, we also know, looking at compensation just in general for equity partners, the West is significantly under the nationwide average. If you look at Moves data, specifically in the Western markets, we all know that partner moves and associate moves, all moves, are down dramatically. The one exception in terms of markets is San Francisco, which is experiencing a 12% increase in year-over-year lateral partner moves so far, and that's Q1 to Q3 of this year. And of course, bankruptcy has seen moves have seen a significant increase for obvious reasons. Associate movement has really fallen off a cliff, with the exception, of course, of bankruptcy, which is obviously very much needed during the pandemic and during this recession. But those, and we'll get to this a little bit later. But the drop in associate lateral movement and that drop in demand is going to reverberate later on. If you actually kind of get into the nitty-gritty in terms of partner moves in Western markets, you'll see very clearly where things sit. And it's great because you'll be getting a copy of these slides. So don't worry, I'm not going to go through this line by line, but you will see the increase on a percentage basis in partner moves in the bankruptcy space. But you will also get a really good look at when we say there has been a dramatic decline, you'll get a really good idea of how large that drop off has been. It's even more pronounced when you look at the associate moves. Those are significantly lower, and you can see, obviously you can see why, but of course in bankruptcy, those have already clicked up a notch as well. So knowing that that's where we are with Western talent markets, the question is where are firms placing their bets now? And these likely will surprise you, and should surprise you. It is very rare. It is very, very rare in circumstances that we're in to see litigation moves this far ahead of corporate moves. It is really unlikely. It usually does not happen this way, and you can see that nationally as well as is in Western markets. Litigation moves in the West are substantially further along than labor and employment. Intellectual property is honestly a little higher than one would think. The bankruptcy is still hanging in there for obvious reasons. I guess the big one that is interesting in this mix is the number of corporate lateral partner moves that we've seen. But to be fair, just as a barometer, this is where people are actually hiring right now. And so it gives you an idea of what the top practice areas are, but also how they relate to one another, both in the West, but also nationally. Now, that said, when we talk about lateral moves and we're talking about the talent market in general, yes, things have declined dramatically, but at the same time, there is still a fair amount of movement out there. And so when you look at the characteristics of that movement, one of the things that you need to look at is red flag rates. And what we mean by red flag rates at Decipher, because a great deal of what we do is deep dive due diligence, pre-hire due diligence on lateral partner hires. When we talk about red flags, that can be anything from problems with personal legal history to non-disclosure of financial difficulties, or, honestly, outright fabrications of things. Sometimes a problem with portable books of business, inaccurate employment history, all sorts of different things will raise a red flag. And of course, all of you being law firm leaders, you have seen this time and time and time again. When we look at 2019 versus 2020 in our project volume and our project experience, we have found that 36% of our candidate investigations have uncovered a red flag. Now, nationwide, that is a 70% increase on the same red flag rate compared to pre-COVID, the pre-COVID era, which is very significant. It is, I'm not gonna gloss it over. That is significant. And there's lots of different reasons why that may be happening. And one way to explore that is to look at these sort of potential threats for 2021 as we look towards the next year. The big ones really are non-performing lateral partners. One question you have to ask in this market is, given the relative nature of what's happening and what we've explored with what the data is telling us, why are partners moving? What is it that is motivating them to move? Sometimes it could be a flight to safety. Sometimes they could be being managed out of their current firms. And so when you have a market that's performing in the way this is, both macroeconomically, but also from a talent perspective, you really have to ask yourself and scrutinize more carefully, why is a partner moving? And really get to the bottom of that. We will definitely see, and I think this came up very much in what Brent talked about and what Dave spoke about, is we will definitely continue to see increased red flags as we go. There's no question that there's a forecast for that. As the market tends to loosen up, and hopefully, God willing, we will see the market loosen up a little bit more as things improve over time, that will release even more talent into the market. And that will, in the short run, meaning the next 12 to 18 months, that should increase that red flag that ratio. Another difficulty is obviously inflated books of business, and you will especially see this in the contentious practices, because a lot of work in contentious practices, litigation, contentious IP, some regulatory work, because that has been so tamped down since the pandemic came really into force, lateral partners trying to get a really good understanding and try to project a more sort of fulsome understanding of what their books of business are likely to look like is challenging. It's very challenging. It's challenging in good times. So you can imagine what it's like under the current circumstances, that you're going to have books of business that really are guesstimates. And that's going to be even more the case in litigation and other contentious areas. Another really is looking at this in terms of law firm leadership. You have to look at that potential flight to safety. As things continue to go on like they are, and obviously we hope that things improve in the short term, medium term, and long term, there will be firms that will be more challenged because of their practice mix or because of their financial condition as we came in to the pandemic. And as a result of that, there will be a flight to safety by some partners who believe that the current condition of their current firm may give them pause or cause for concern about what the future of their practice looks like and what the future of the firm looks like in terms of their ability to service their clients. And as a result of that, you may see individual partners or teams look to the market to see if they maybe should consider moving to a firm that they believe is more stable for their particular practice. So that's really important. So, but let's also look at the opportunities. So one of the big opportunities, and one I think honestly you should look at as an opportunity, is there is going to be a real premium in 2021 and beyond, and we saw this in the Great Recession. There will be a real premium put on experienced associates. Really experienced associates, there will be a premium on those. And so one of the opportunities to think about is what you're doing in the associate retention space. Really looking carefully at what your program is for retaining associates. As we know, that associate market will get frothy. I mean, it's just math. There are lots and lots of associates, young, newly minted and younger associates that are coming onto the market for the first time. And there is not enough hours to give them to work. And so by definition, that associate market will get fairly clogged. At the same time, many of those associates that are younger, given the circumstances of the pandemic, won't have the opportunity to get the kind of experience that you as leaders would like them to have. So on the one hand, you're going to have a very frothy associate market, as there are way more associates than there are hours to bill, at least in the medium term. And on the other side, there will be a real premium on really well qualified, well-developed, experienced associates. So those retention programs are really key. And one thing that Brent mentioned earlier in his presentation, when you look at the 2-year trends on recruitment, on recruitment spend, what we're seeing with a lot of our clients is that they are embracing direct recruitment more as time goes on, meaning doing recruitment without the use of a recruitment consultant or a headhunter. That's a direct tie-in between what we're seeing, and when you look at Brent's data, that is a direct tie-in between the fall off in lateral movement. In addition, the ability of firms to pivot to more direct recruitment. We're seeing that much more in the associate markets, but we're also seeing a move to that in the partner markets. So it's something to think about. Well, why is that, and what kind of opportunities does that project for 2021 and beyond? One is that a lot of recruiting directors and CTOs will tell you that they've really gotten the hang of virtual recruitment. They're much better at moving virtual recruitment along. And what they have found is that virtual recruitment is faster and it's less expensive. Doing more things by Zoom and doing more things from home to home or office to home moves things along more quickly. And as a result of more firms doing more things that they never thought they could do before, being able to pivot to models that are really dramatically different. Dave talked a lot earlier about acceleration. Firms have been very impressive in their ability to really grab a hold of not only technological improvements, but process and strategy improvements that maybe they never really thought they would need to do or would want to do, but they've kind of grabbed them with both hands and they've accelerated through them and they've done them very, very well. And one of those areas is in recruitment. And when you take virtual recruitment, you move things through more quickly, and you add on top of that appropriate due diligence for your hires, whether at partner or associate level, what you find is that those things move more quickly. You can do this, and you can do them much more effectively with higher success rates at a much lower expense, at a much lower cost. The other thing to look at, and I know that sometimes in the talent market, people don't really want to speak about this out loud, which is completely understandable. But there are and there will be distressed opportunities in the market. And keeping your eyes open to what those opportunities are, and both looking at those by market from a macro sense, but also looking at it from practice area, and also looking at things in terms of micro targeting. You are going to find, if you pay attention to peer monitor data, if you pay attention to Decipher data, if you listen to the kind of things that you're hearing from Armanino and you'll hear from Steve on, and you pay attention to those metrics over time, you will see areas both geographically and from a practice area perspective where there are opportunities for growth, both from a flight to safety standpoint, but also from a macro standpoint for firms that really maybe didn't enter the pandemic in the best situation. And there will be, and that's the normal life cycle of business and the normal life cycle of firms, is that a lot of these great experienced partners with wonderful clients and well-developed practices will need a stronger, more stable, better platform for the future. So with that, Steve, I'll just turn it back to you, and hopefully we'll get the opportunity to get some questions in here at the end.
Great, Michael, thank you. And for those of you who are not familiar with Decipher, I can tell you that their deep dive due diligence on potential candidates can absolutely save you not only money, which is important, but heartache. And for those firms that culturally do not ask or do not do these deep dives, Decipher can help you with that background research. So I encourage you to reach out to Michael and his team. So how do we pull all this together and we start thinking about strategy? Just some thoughts as an overview. Some of the slides I'm going to show you contain what you'll call business school jargon. I hear that all the time. By the way, that's okay, because the slides contain business school jargon. As Dave mentioned, and as I've heard since the slowdown and recession in 1999 and 2000, which impacted law firms, and again in 2008, 9, 10, we've got to start running our firms more like a business. The problem is lawyers and law school, and certainly my education, doesn't train you how to run a business. So you need particular skill sets. Running partnerships, running professional services firms is distinctly different from running businesses and corporations. You know, business schools have latched onto this. In 2004, 5, and 6, Hildebrandt partnered with George Washington University and created the first program offering an MBA in law firm management. Brad Hildebrandt got together with Carl Leonard, managing partner at Morrison & Forster, and Jim Jones, managing partner at Arnold & Porter, to create this program. It's where I received my MBA in law firm management. It's where the faculty is about 85% law firm senior executives and about 15% George Washington MBA faculty. So now we begin to develop the talent, and you find these programs in a number of universities around the country now. And in addition, Harvard, Stanford, UPenn, and Wharton all are offering outstanding summer programs for executive training and law firm management. So the other thing I want to mention as an overview is I'm going to be referencing several surveys and other sources that are looking at the legal industry so that I can get you some more information on what's happening right now. So let's talk about why law firm strategy is necessary. First of all, the greatest threat to your law firms is uncertainty. It breeds doubt. It leads to fear, which leads to panic, which takes the eye off the ball. Many of you are experiencing this. Many of you are getting calls late at night about this. The lack of a vision now, the lack of direction, can be the undoing of the business. And many times, perhaps more so, because you've got so many owners in your business. So what holds the firm together? Well, it's what I call the normative culture. It's what happens every day. It's the behaviors of your people, how they interact with each other, how they interact with your clients, with other lawyers, what your reputation is. It's all built around culture, and culture is your glue. So strategy helps you build direction and vision. It helps you focus on the right things, making tough choices when you have limited resources. It's a guide to managing change. And that's really what you need to do. Altman Weil over the summer surveyed 30 mid-sized law firm managing partners and COOs. And in their survey, by far, the largest issue they found expressed by law firm leaders was the fact that they're most worried about their culture. So your strategic plan can provide that direction. Let's talk about how you win in the marketplace. First of all, how do you lead an adaptive firm, a firm that can manage change? Well, in business school, they'll teach you and teach us that there's something called the Sigmund curve, which is actually a formula. It says nothing lasts forever, and originally growth will curve and plateau and sink if you don't do something to stop it. I can't tell you how many times I'm in a firm where the executive committee or managing partner says, you know, we really need to implement a change management program. And the thing that holds it back is the firms have been having successful years for the last 4 or 5 years. It's very hard to involve people talking about change when things are going well. But this is leadership's defining moment now. It's the firms that can adapt to change that are going to win in the marketplace. You know, Altman Weil, again, in one of their surveys on characteristics of leadership, year over year over year, come back with 4 key leadership traits: honesty, competency, forward-looking, and inspiring. Mid-level associates in that survey said the worst thing law firm leaders can do is what they call tap around the truth. They want you to be straight with them. They want you to tell you what's going on. They want transparency. Most of all, they want to know, where are we going? What's the direction? McKinsey right now is publishing a series of leadership and business in the future after the pandemic. And what they're telling us is leaders need to think differently. They need to be more inclusive, empathetic. They need to strive for equality in their teams and in their workforces. And they note that the pandemic has really leveled the playing field in many industries. Market leaders have been forced to look at internally, to look at expenses rather than look at growth. And that's enabled faster, quicker, more nimble competitors to attack in the marketplace. And McKinsey's urging those market leaders to get back into attack mode and take a look at even mergers and acquisitions. So let's take a look at strategy and planning. And I know most of you know this. I just want to put this up quickly. Strategy is a leadership process. It defines where you're going. It defines where to compete, choices, focus. It's leading from looking outside in. It's what I call client driven. Planning, on the other hand, is the management process that gets you there. It provides discipline, it creates forecasts, it's an inside out look. Many firms default to operational planning. It's data driven, it's measurable, you see results on a regular schedule, it can be reactive, it's easy to communicate to your partners about what's happening. What I want to talk about is strategy and frameworks around how you can think about leadership process. Professor Mintzberg at McGill School of Business has identified in his articles what he thinks are 12 different strategies for business. At George Washington, we looked at 3 of these strategies as appropriate in what we find today in law firms. The plan strategy, which we find in smaller first generation firms many times with very strong managing partners or executive committees, is this is where we're going. Follow me. It's the plan strategy. It's dictated top down. Many mid-sized firms have a process strategy. It's the way it's always done. It's the way we can run our systems. It's what HR tells us to do. It's how we track hours. It's a process, and you can run your strategy as long as you don't go outside the process. A lot of firms, which don't really focus on strategy, but when you go back and take a look at what they've done, in other words, backward looking, it's really unconnected strategies. You find this where you have leadership that's more focused on operations than it is on growth. You find this where you have very strong practice group leaders, very strong geographic leaders, very strong rainmakers. And it creates conflict in the firm many times. And I'm sure many of you have lived through periods where you have an unconnected strategy. I want to suggest a different strategy for these times. I want to take a look at a strategic approach for now. It's what I call the umbrella strategy. This is focusing on the glue of the firm, the values that your partners believe in, that you need to have to succeed, the behaviors that exhibit those values. And the strategy then lives under that umbrella. It's okay to have a few that are going a little bit sideways, but they're staying under the umbrella and they're dealing and living with the values you have. And to do this, you need to assess your culture. Lots of firms have been doing this now. There's any number of assessments out there. Assessments can take 3 hours. We have one that takes a half hour. They give you valuable insight into the values of your partners and what they believe you need to succeed going forward. Let's take a look at an overview of a strategic approach, strategic learning. This is the program that GW teaches in their law firm management MBA program. It's been built out by Willie Peterson, who is professor of practice of management at the Columbia School of Business. He earned his MBA, his LLM in law in South Africa. He's a Rhodes Scholar. He has an MA in jurisprudence. He practiced law for a number of years and then went into international business and ran multi-billion-dollar divisions of Unilever and Seagram's, amongst others. His book, which is called Reinventing Strategy, has 4 key looping activities. First of all, to understand the insights both externally, and we gave you a lot of that data today, and then also the insights internally, to use those insights to define your strategic choice, that 1 or 2 areas you're going to focus on, and articulate the vision for that. Have a winning proposition. How are you going to differentiate yourself in the marketplace? Take a look at your internal systems, your people, your structure, most importantly, your culture. Where are the gaps? Where are the capacities? What do you need to build up? What may perhaps you need to restructure? And then get your operation action plan and execute. Now, all of this is meaningless if you don't continually learn from what's happening in your implementation stage. You've got to continually focus on what your people are bringing back and the learnings. And one of the things that you really need to focus on is making hard decisions, saying no, making sure you're right sizing, you're dealing with underperformers. All of that comes out from your internal insights. If you're not doing a regression financial study on your practice groups, your offices, if you have them, even individual partners, now is the time to really understand profitability of these different groups. You need to look at your project management skills, the measurements and milestones, the mechanisms, the reporting rigor you're using today. So how do you go about developing your firm's strategy now? Well, historically, on the next slide, you would have pre-COVID, for those firms that do deep dive strategic planning, you would have the executive committee or perhaps a specific strategic planning committee made up of practice group leaders, senior staff leaders, perhaps senior rainmakers, office leaders. It would be a long process. I've been involved in strategic planning processes that take anywhere from 18 months to 2 years. I'd suggest that that's not going to work today. What you would be better off today is what I call a headlights committee. You need to be looking out just at the end of these headlights, be that 3 months or 6 months. I suggest a small team, 5 to 7 people, people that are not perhaps on the executive committee, people who are seen as strategic leaders in the firm, people who are respected partners. I would put some contrarians on this, the people who always say, yes, but. Perhaps rather than a consultant that does the work, I would suggest a coach that asks the questions that need to be asked. And what are these headlight committee marching orders? First of all, to understand your growth pathways. First and foremost, existing clients. What do you need to do to retain them? First of all, which ones are the right ones? You'll get that out of your regression study. What do you need to retain them? And then strategically, where are the other look-alike clients? From what sectors? How do you go after them? How do you get your current clients to refer you? Should you be growing new geographic offices? Should be looking at new practice areas? What are your competitors doing and what's their strategy? And secondly, in focus, it's really meaningless, in my opinion, to come up with a strategy if you don't have rationales that are understandable to everybody in the firm and you don't allocate the necessary resources to get that done, be it actual hard dollars and business development, headcount, office space, etc. And then you need to do the hard work of aligning the firm, reduce processes, push decision-making down to your practice groups, get stuff done more quickly, make sure they have the right people. Understand, as Dave and others have said, what's worked that will help you reduce costs over the last few months, and what isn't working, and figure out how to fix that. Your role as leaders is to get buy-in to the plan. You need to be able to communicate, especially with contrarians and practice group leaders, with influential partners. You know, if you look at firms in the last recession, the ones that seemed to come out ahead were the ones that understood their gaps in capabilities and capacities. They managed their talent better. They invested in technology where they needed to. They invested and maintained marketing and business development activities. And those are some things you should be looking at as you do your insights. On the cultural side, if you don't understand the culture, if you don't believe it is getting buy-in, do an assessment. Figure out what you need to win going forward. Those values are what will differentiate your firm. Always happy to talk to you about strategy and culture, but now I want to turn it over to you, the audience, to see what questions you might have for the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks to all the presenters. That was some really good insights into all the stuff that's happening right now in the market. So we do have a couple of questions, but again, I want to just open it up to the audience that if you have more questions, please use the chat or the question box on your webinar pane to submit your questions, and we'll read them out as they come. So to the panelists, we've gotten a few already. Dave, first question is actually to you. In your presentation, you had mentioned that you guys have been measuring productivity. The question is, how are you measuring productivity?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I understand it when we say, how are we measuring productivity? I'd have to go back to the actual um, slide we were talking about. Productivity, for an overview, productivity that we usually measure is based on hours. I believe, and Brett can probably speak to that. I think Peer Monitor talks about productivity on an hours-based basis, focus. You may want to respond to
Yeah,
that, but we usually
yeah.
measure.
Apologies for that, Dave. I was fighting to get myself off of mute there. Yeah, the way Peer Monitor would view it, productivity would simply be hours divided by lawyer FTEs.
Right. Great. So we have another question. So it says you talk about data and metrics as well as remote work is not going back, but what about building firm culture and how wanting to work for a firm and in the business of the firm has a role in building that data? Will we all just be workers working and sharing overhead without the culture? Does culture matter? Does it play into the data and metrics?
Well, data matters because it's operational. It gives you milestones. It gives you an opportunity to measure where you're going. Culture helps your people make decisions, even when they're remote. They understand what would be acceptable to the partnership. They understand the behaviors when you deal with clients or in courtrooms or with other lawyers. They understand what's expected in pro bono work or in dealing with the community. So data feeds and supports your culture. The culture is the glue that's going to hold you together, whether everybody's remote or everybody's together.
And I agree with that 100%. I mean, it's not just law firms. Law firms are facing this maybe for the first time, this massive remote workforce. But there have been other industries that have already been remote and have been successful in dealing with their culture. What Steve said is very true. Sarah, I have a quick question. Maybe we can put this to the panelists. I would be interested, and we didn't pre-do this, is what do people think, Steve, Michael, Brett, what do you guys think that the number one issue facing law firms in the next, whatever, 12 to 24 months is?
But a
This is
paraphrase,
Brent.
go ahead, go ahead.
Oh, apologies. Sorry, Steve. This is Brent. I think one thing that really stands out for me, and I didn't really cover this at all, but we see pretty heavy contraction in litigation demand. And this is speaking across all of the U.S., not in the Western region. But the early look at August, again, is that it's one of our heaviest declining practices. And that makes up 28% of Peer Monitor's hours. Pre-2008, it made up 36%. So clearly the GFC completely reformed litigation. Alternative legal service providers came about, and then matters started getting disaggregated and things like that. But that is a massive anchor around the ankles of the overall market until litigation comes back. And if and when it does come back, what does it look like? Does it take another blow? And since that's a significant piece of most firms' portfolio, I think that needs to be a major focus as we move through the end of 20 and into 21.
And Brent, it's Michael Ellenhorn. That was the part that has got a lot of people scratching their heads about what's going on in the talent markets, because it's not just in the West, it's actually in several other major markets across the country where litigation hires are actually still outpacing corporate hires. And this is for the first time in years. Well, as you said, the metrics tell us that litigation has slowed down dramatically.
So we've got 60 seconds left. Steve,
Just
what do you think the one?
Two thoughts on that.
Yeah.
One is, I know in San Diego, where I'm based, there are 20,000 criminal cases on hold in our courts in San Diego, just criminal side.
Yeah.
I know in talking to clients, their litigation departments are clamoring to hire because when the dike opens, it's going to be a flood.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say is, to paraphrase some of our politicians, let no crisis go to waste. It is almost impossible to affect change in law firms because of the success they've had for the last 4 or 5 years. You have your partner's attention now. They want to know, what are we going to change to be successful? Use the opportunity.
And
All
I
right.
agree with that. My number one is strategy and succession. And I agree with you, Steve. So thank you. Go ahead, Sarah.
All right. Well, thank you to all our panelists. That was a very interesting presentation. And just a reminder to all the attendees, we will be sending a link to the recording and the deck 24 hours after this presentation. And so keep a lookout in your inbox from an email from Armanino. If you don't receive one, please make sure to check your spam folder. And if you still don't receive one, feel free to reply back to your confirmation email asking for the link. Again, thank you everyone for your time, and we hope to see more of these webinars in the future. So we look forward to those. All right, take care.